Hey, Dr. Mehler, coming at you this morning with more bad news. We got our Thursday morning 9:30 Zoom class, and I've already started the recording going. And what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about this part of the chapter. Let me share just screen for a minute here, just a little bit. This is what we're going to talk. This is chapter 20. This is the end of the chapter. It's called The Great Depression and the coming of the Great Depression. And resignation pro to Hoover's response. Herbert Hoover was president of the United States during the time of the Great Depression, worsening economic outlook, freedom in the modern world. The Great Depression really caused a lot of democracies to collapse, and that's the end of the chapter. So this is the last section of the chapter, which is appropriate since this is our last meeting this week. And what I wanted to do was to talk a little bit about the Great Depression. Why was it great? If it was the Great Depression, doesn't that mean that there were other depressions that weren't so great? Well, and in fact, if you've been reading and paying attention, you may have noticed that we did have but they called it a panic, actually. They didn't call it a depression. The word depression, these economic collapses were originally called panics. Because people panicked. They lost their money, so they panicked. The bank went out, so they panicked. Especially in the old days when there was no federal guarantee. It's like today, if a bank goes under, you and I wouldn't necessarily lose our deposit because the federal government, one of the things that was created during the New Deal was the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. You'll notice those letters on the banks, FDIC, they're on all the banks. If they're not there, I would recommend you take your money and put them someplace else, because FDIC means that the federal government guarantees that the money that you have in the bank is going to be safe. And if the bank goes under, and banks do, the hanky-panky goes around, people steal the money, they disappear, the whole thing. So if a bank goes under and you have your life savings in the bank, you lose your life savings. Not anymore. After the Great Depression, the federal government said if the bank goes under and you lose your life savings, we, the federal government, will reimburse you, we'll give you your money. So up to I think it's $250,000 today. At that time, it's like $5,000 or something. But so, and the word to the wise, if you have more than $250,000 in any one bank account, like if you have $500,000 in your West Michigan savings account, what I recommend is you go down there right away and take $250,000 out of it and put it into chemical, because you don't want to have more than the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is going to guarantee. Before the Great Depression, if the bank went under, you lost everything, and there's no place to go. So, and in 1893, we had a pretty good-sized depression. They called it a panic. It was 1893 to 1897. Lasted for 4 years. And if you go back in time, the first panic that we have in American history is 1818. The bottom dropped out of the cotton market in England, and it collapsed the American the cotton prices fell. It's 1818. 98% of all Americans are farmers. If you're in Ohio, or Pennsylvania, and you have a farm and you're growing grain and turning it into bourbon, the collapse of the cotton exchange in England is, it's not going to affect you terribly much. By 1893, at least half of Americans are already living in cities, urban, and huge population of Americans are now working in factories. They have jobs. And when the economy collapses in 1893, people lose those jobs, and then they're evicted from their homes, apartments, and then then you got real suffering. So you have the first panic is 1818, and then there's 1837 and 1857, right before the Civil War, and the Southern Slave Society kind of like sailed through it, and they laughed at the North because the Industrial Society had collapsed. And so what we have is beginning the American Republic, 1776. We have a revolution that creates a republic instead of a monarchy. That's what's new in the world. In 1776, all the countries in the world have kings, and we have not a king, we have a president. And the difference is that a president is elected by somebody. It's not a democracy, never mind democracy, but it's a republic, which means that the president is not a king. He isn't endowed with his powers from heaven. He gets his powers from the electorate. And it was also inaugurates a new system of economics from economics under the king is different than economics under a president. Under a republic, business exists in order to make a profit for the business person. Under the king, everything exists to serve the king, to serve the empire. The king doesn't like your face, off with his head. England had a constitutional monarchy, but it was still a monarchy. You still have authority coming from heaven. And that translates into a very different economic situation. In America, American colonists, for example, could only do business according to the rules and regulations that the king laid out. That means that there were things that were quite profitable. For example, we had tobacco, but we weren't allowed to take our tobacco and put it on. We had ships. We could sail all the way to China, all the way to India, bring our tobacco, trade it for tea, and bring it right back to America. We could cut out the middleman, and instead, we weren't allowed to do that. We weren't even allowed to take the iron ore that we had and the coal that we had and turn it into steel, metals, into iron. We weren't allowed. It was forbidden. Just the rules and regulations for how to do our business that were up in our business. The American Revolution came along and created what we call now capitalism. How do you like that? It's a system that didn't exist for always. It emerges at a certain time in history, and it changes over time. So that now we are in the end stage of capitalism. Kind of, capitalism has been developing for 200 years, and this is capitalism in its old age. And throughout the existence of capitalism, you have periodically a panic or a collapse or depression. By 1929, they started to call it the depression, called the Great Depression. People, instead of getting panicked, were depressed, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, now you have something like earthquakes. It's like you live in San Francisco, and the history. There was an earthquake in this year, and an earthquake in that year, and an earthquake in another year, and that there's another one coming. You don't know exactly. So what is the mechanism that generates the earthquake? Now, you can't predict exactly when the earthquake is going to come, but you can understand the basics. That is that the planet has plates, and the land masses are actually floating on these plates, and the plates come in, and one goes under and one goes over, and they rub against each other, and tension builds up. And periodically, where those plates are meeting, there's there'll be they're shoving against each other slowly, a little bit, and then the tension breaks open, and you have an earthquake. And so we kind of understand the basic mechanisms of earthquakes, but we still don't have any idea how to predict with any kind of accuracy when the next earthquake is going to be. The same is true with these economic problems. Capitalism has a problem in terms of maintaining stability. What happens is you have cycles of business growth and technological development and concentration of wealth. And periodically, what happens is you have this huge production. That's what happened in 1893. We had a fabulous industrial economy, and we were producing massive amounts of goods, but our workers in our population, we couldn't sell them all in America. So you had a lot of stuff left over. And the question was, were you going to be able to sell these on, to get rid of, dump this stuff, like on an international market? And what happens in the Great Depression is that these international markets collapse. For example, the simplest one to understand is the agricultural one, which the Great Depression starts for farmers in the 1920s. And that's because after World War I, farmers in Europe were able to go out onto the fields and plant their crops and grow their crops and sell their crops. So they didn't need to buy American farm goods. So the basic mechanism for this collapse of prices and of the economy is that you have these goods and you can't sell them. You got bogged down in this case because your European market is no longer a market for you. They're not buying your stuff; they're making their own. But more fundamentally, you have. Take, for example, the tobacco industry. We have a commercial sponsor here is Camel cigarettes, and where does cigarettes come from? And they come really out of this period where you have industrial machinery taking tobacco and rolling it into these little cigarettes and putting them into packages by the gazillions, and so you can create this enormous amount of product, but you have to get it out there. You've got to get people to start consuming those things. Otherwise, you're just stuck with a warehouse full of packages of, packs of cigarettes that you can't unload, and your business goes out. What happens in the Great Depression is that you have this massive industrial economy, but you have a collapse of aggregate demand. It's the main theory for the explanation of the Great Depression. There's another one we'll get to next week. But for this week, let's focus on just the collapse of aggregate demand. Now, aggregate demand means the overall demand for products. So what you have is in Detroit, Henry Ford is putting out cars by the millions. But people aren't able to afford to buy them. And so he shuts down his factory because he doesn't need any more cars. He's got piles and piles of brand new cars in warehouses and lots, and he has no way to, so he shuts down the factory. He's not going to make any new cars until he can sell the old inventory, because everybody does the same thing. And suddenly you have this situation in which you've got the factory, everything's working fine. You got all the parts that go into the factory. You've got the coal and the steel and everything else. The workers are right outside the factory. They'd like to come in and work and make cars, but everything is stalled because of the collapse of aggregate demand. So how do you get demand back again? And this collapse was so serious that we couldn't figure out a way to restart the economy until World War II. So what really ended the Great Depression was for the countries of the world all to begin to arm. Now remember, let's go back to the beginning here. After World War I, Germany was made to pay enormous reparations payments for the damage that they caused in World War I. They had to make payments to England and France. England and France during World War I had borrowed enormous amounts of money from the United States. So they owed us. So we had an arrangement where we loaned the Germans the money that they needed to pay back their reparations payments. And then they used that money to pay the French and the British, who used that money to pay us back. So the money was kind of going in a kind of this circle. Come the Great Depression, the bankers said, we can't afford this system anymore. And so they shut it down. And when they shut that down, that meant that the French and the British could no longer pay us. The Germans defaulted on their loans, and all hell broke loose. And what we did in response was to jack up our tariffs to protect our own industries from competition. They all did the same thing. So now everybody's protecting their industry from competition, which means that there's no international trade. Once you get stuck in a place like that where nothing is moving, it's very hard to get the machine up and running again. And during the Great Depression, there were a lot of different attempts made. But they made a little bit of a difference, but it was never enough until all the countries began gearing up for war, because then the government creates enormous demand. The government demands workers that turn them into soldiers, and we put millions of people into the army. The government needs uniforms and guns and boats, and Henry Ford can start his factory up again now and make tanks and jeeps and things for the government, and everything by the World War II, everything is rolling along, and by the end of World War II, we are the wealthiest nation that the world had ever known. That's when I was born. You talk about being born with a silver spoon, not in your mouth, but it's right there, because I was born at a time when the United States was this just enormously wealthy country with all kinds of possibilities for the future. So the Great Depression is one of many depressions. It is fundamentally a problem in the capitalist system. And if you think about the problem, which is that, today, what you have is big corporations that control everything, that, like Facebook, it's just in the news right now. And these corporations they buy up smaller corporations, and what you end up with is a world dominated by mega corporations. In 2008, we had a collapse just enormous collapse, financial collapse, global, worldwide. Trillions of dollars were lost. Millions of people were thrown into poverty. So after the Great Depression and World War II, there were attempts that were made to fix the problems that capitalism had. But apparently, actually, I was going to say apparently they didn't work, but the fixes actually were working fine. And then Congress, in their wisdom, decided that they didn't need those fixes anymore, and they took away the guardrails, and all hell broke loose. That's the more complicated story I don't want to get into right now. So that's the Great Depression, and the many depressions before it, and the depressions that came afterwards. 2008 was certainly the Great Depression. We didn't call it that, but it really was. It was bigger than the 1929 collapse. For your professor, I believe that we are now at the point where the capitalist system is pretty much done in, and we'll see what's going to happen, but that's about as far as we need to go for this chapter. So there you have it. It's now been going on for about 20 minutes. I'm going to leave that as our Zoom class for Thursday, the 7th of October. and I'm working on a um, weekly assignment for you for Sunday. If you have any problems, if you have any questions, you know where I am. I'll talk to you, and I'll see you in class on Tuesday if you want to come and schmooze, because we've been having some really good small classes. It's no requirement. Zoom is not required. The F2F is not required. But that doesn't mean that you can't come. And I'm here, and it does mean that you'll get a lot of one-on-one attention. So with that, I'll wish you a good weekend, and talk later. Bye-bye.